Hello, dear students. Welcome back to the course on investment project management. And while we're waiting for the rest of the audience to get connected, I'd like to begin with sharing with you an resource. Probably some of you already know about it. It is the web link to the actual schedule and curriculum for the courses. So please, if you have any questions about the timing and the dates for the exam for both courses, investment project management and alternative investments, please address this page, because if we will have any changes in a schedule, so maybe it will be another time for the exam or date for exam, it will be reflected here. So the actual information about the schedule for exams is here, and probably if something is not updated in LMS, it will be done in a coming days. So please address this page, and we have the date for investment project management exam on 21st of December and alternative investments on the 20th. Okay. And now let us switch back to the presentation from the previous session. We have few points left, and let us discuss environmental risks in respect to the investment project management. So I also will switch on the chart. Probably if some of you have additional questions, please type in the chat or raise a hand. We'll discuss this issue. So the project's impact on the surrounding environment during both the construction and operation phases may need to be considered. An environmental impact assessment, or shortly EIA, may be needed for this purpose. Sponsors cannot rely on keeping within environmental laws and regulations. They need to consider whether any environmental aspects of the project leaves them at risk of opposition to construction or operation of the project, indirectly discouraging lenders from getting involved with it. Even if the project company is acting within the law, it may still be at risk on wider political grounds. Public opposition to the project may cause the host government or the government of the country where the project is taking place to reconsider its obligations under a project agreement. Similarly, the lenders themselves may find themselves under attack for supporting a project that is perceived by the audience to be environmentally damaging. And as we can see, the environmental assessment and the political and social assessment comes very closely now. So probably if the project is not environmentally sound, it can also trigger not only environmental consideration, but also social and political considerations that can lead to a very negative attitude. What about the environmental impact assessment? The first stage in obtaining both construction and operating permits is often to prepare an EIA for the project. The EIA examines the environmental impact of the project in a variety of ways, such as the effect of construction and operation of the project on the surrounding natural environment, like plants, animals, habitats, landscapes, etc. The effect of construction on any historical remains, the effect of construction on local communities, including noise, dust, air pollution, and construction traffic. The level of emissions into the atmosphere caused by operation of the project, water abstraction and discharge, disposal of waste products, for example, tailing from a mine or ash from a coal-fired power station, long-term effects of the project on the local traffic, transportation, and utilities, and other long-term effects of the project on the local communities or the natural environment. Following this assessment, which at minimum must clearly demonstrate that the project complies with legal requirements on such environmental issues, an environmental permit may be obtained. And we have the Equator Principles, that these principles were launched by a group of leading project finance banks in 2003, and the following years were several revisions. So the financial institutions that adhere to the Equator Principles pledge to maintain these standards in their project finance lending, and hence not to finance projects which do not meet these standards. And these standards are directly now implementing in various global and local ESG regulations. So ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance principles that now is a trending concept of letting finance for the project that complies with the wide variety of principles in all the spheres like environmental assessment, social impact, and the in-house and out-house governance procedures implied by the company or by the project. So I can say that it is already on the table, and this trend will grow and grow, and probably already in 5 to 10 years there will be virtually no or very hard to receive financing or funding without complying with ESG principles. So please, as a financial professionals dealing with analysis of finance, letting finance, etc., please be aware of these trends and taking it into account in your professional life. So we have 10 principles within the Equator Principles. Principle 1, review and categorization. New project proposals will be categorized based on the International Finance Corporation environmental and social screening criteria. These categories are: Category A, projects with potential significant adverse social and environmental impacts that are diverse, irreversible, and unprecedented. Category B, projects with potential limited adverse social or environmental impacts that are few in number, generally site-specific, largely reversible, and readily addressed through mitigation measures. And category C, projects with minimal or no social or environmental impacts. The principles relate primarily to category A projects or B projects in non-OECD or OECD low-income countries. Then we have a principle 2, environmental and environmental assessment and impact. So this assessment to be carried out for all category and A and category B projects. That means this assessment should be done for these projects in any case. Principle C, applicable social and environmental standards. Projects must adhere these standards that we mentioned, but in a high-income OECD countries should adhere also to the national laws. Principle 4, Environmental and Social Management System, ESMS, and Equator Principles Action Plan. Project sponsors are required to prepare an ESMS and Environmental and Social Management Plan, ESMP, to comply with applicable standards, or, if required by the lender, an action plan which confirms the Equator principles. Principle 5, stakeholder engagement. For all category A and category B projects, the lender will require the client to demonstrate effective shareholder engagement as an ongoing process in a structured and culturally appropriate manner. Principle 6, grievance mechanism. This must enable the borrower to receive and facilitate resolution of concerns and grievances about the project's social and environmental performance raised by individuals or groups from among project-affected communities. Principle 7, independent review. An independent social and environmental expert not directly associated with the borrower will review the processes set out above and assess Equator Principles compliance. Principle 8, covenants. The financing documentation will include covenants to comply with all with all relevant social and environmental laws, regulations, and the permits, and for category A and B projects. To comply with the ESMP and the Equator Principle Action Plan during the construction and operating of the project. To report periodically on the above requirements and to decommission the project in accordance with pre-agreed plan. And we have Principle 9, independent monitoring and reporting. This is done through appointment of an independent environmental and social consultant. Principle 10, reporting and transparency. Institutions are to make annual reports on the application of the principles. And if we will look at how these principles are embedded in the USDG standards, then we can see then all these principles are in place and even more tough now, and not complying with the principles can lead to very severe consequences for the project, like the abandon of financing, and also not complying with such principles and not planning to comply for such principles beforehand can lead to increased cost of the project. So probably you faultly not plan to have this ESG compliance consultant in place. That means that either you have to raise additional money to finance its costs, or probably you will not get money at all because you are not comply with ESG principles. So that is what have left from the previous session, and we now can continue to very complex theme, that is of due diligence and risk analysis of economic and regulatory risks. If you have any questions, probably some of you have questions about these sessions, the materials, slides, tasks, etc. It is the time we can discuss it now. And I already have mails from you. Probably some of you missed lecture for that or another reason. No worries, please write me a mail. I will send you the slides that you are missing. And probably I will find a place, say on a Google Disk, to put all the lectures we passed to easier access for you. So please, if you have any questions, raise a hand, type in the chat. We have now a very short break for 2 minutes just to refresh ourselves, make a cup of coffee or tea. So 2 minutes for you to decide or type in any questions you have. Okay, welcome back. And we move on to economic risks and regulatory and political risks. External microeconomic risks, that are also known as economic risk or financial risks, namely are changes in interest rates, inflation, currency exchange rates that do not relate to the project in particular, but to the economic environment in which it operates. And this risk need to be analyzed and mitigated, that is hedged, in the same way as the specific commercial risks we discussed in the previous lectures. And also a mismatch between a short-term loan and a long-term project is another form of microeconomic risk. If we're talking about regulatory and political risks, all major projects have political aspects. The project company may therefore be subject to political risks relating to the project's presence in a particular country and its relationship with this government of this country, rather than to more general commercial and macroeconomic risk aspects of the project we discussed previously. These political risks will be discussed here, and there are two main areas of risk relating to government actions. First, it's a regulatory or change in law risk, which affect all projects to some extent. And secondly, investment risks, which mainly affect cross-border projects investment, primarily in developing countries. Linked to the latter are quasi-political risks, which relate to government taking indirect action against the project. We can see that this instrument of quasi-political and quasi-economical pressure on the project became more popular in the recent decades. So please again be aware of this instrument that can be heavily used for these such projects. Interest rate risk. If the project is being financed with fixed rate bonds and loans from lenders providing fixed rate funding, then in principle, the project company has no interest risk. In many markets, however, bank lenders do not provide long-term loans at fixed rates because the deposit base is short-term and fixed rate long-term funding is either unavailable or uneconomic. The base interest rate on the project finance loans is thus often adjusted at intervals, say 6 monthly, to the interest rate, to the current wholesale market interest rate at which the lenders raise their funding. and is therefore on a floating, that is variable rate rather than a fixed rate basis. In the international market, the most important floating rate was the London Interbank Offer Rate, so LIBOR. Now it was removed, and we'll have another proxies to base on. But the principle remains the same, that interest rates are quoted by banks for borrowing from lending to each other in major international currencies with respect for such a proxy or some standard rate. Banks leaving their lending on the quote of their interest rates for the financing as the margin over this so-called base rate, with the base interest rate usually refixed against the current rate every 3 to 6 months. These are known as rate fixing dates or interest dates. Construction phase interest rate risks, what are they? Interest is not paid in cash on the financing until the project is in operation. During the construction phase, the accrued interest is normally capitalized, that is added to the loan amount. So you cannot pay in cash because you are not in operation, you're not receiving money, but you have to account for these accrued interests. So you add it to the principal of the loan. So you can capitalize, that is a normal practice, or pay it by making a new drawing on the loan. So probably you will not want to capitalize, but to pay the interest while borrowing probably on the better terms in another loan. Thus, interest rates during construction, called IDC, becomes part of the project's capital budget. And if the interest rate for the IDC is not fixed, it is eventually higher than the original project. This is a construction cost overrun. Lenders do not normally allow the general construction costs contingency to be used to cover this risk. And it is primarily intended to cover overruns in a hard costs, mainly the construction contract, or the effect of delay causing higher total interest rate. So we see here the principle of dividing the purpose and the sources of financing this contingent risk. Like if you are to manage the interest rate risk, that you should not take the money from contingency account that is devoted to cover risk related to the cost overrun for the construction itself. Like you realize that you need to construct another design of the project, so this can lead for cost overrun, and that can be covered from contingency account. Or you delay it for some reason, like having some additional consideration and surveys to be done until you can commence the construction, then it also can cover it by contingency account. But you cannot cover your interest rate additional costs from such an account, because you should separate risk and to deal with this risk separately. And also we have operating phase interest rate risk. And during the operation phase, a higher interest rate leads to a lower project cash flow, and hence reduction in the lender's cover ratios and lower returns for investors. One simple method of dealing with the interest rate risk during the operation phase, which can be used by projects with this offtake contract, is to include a capacity charge, or in an availability-based contract is for the contract payments to be changed as the underlying market interest rates on the project's company debt change. So to include the provision in your contracts for that allow you to change the prices according to the changes on the market, especially in the interest rates. This, of course, means that the long-term interest rate risk is taken by this party, the off-taker or contracting consortium. So to those companies who buys your services or products. The latter is really a better position to take the risk, as it can probably obtain an interest rate swap or other hedging instrument on a better terms than the project company. Again, remember, we establish a project company as a single purpose entity. It has no additional assets. It solely rely on the cash flow streams. So when you need to raise additional insurances, additional financing that was not foreseen when you're preparing the project, probably it will be very hard. But an off-taker, so for example, in our cogeneration project, the local utility who purchases your electricity, steam, gas, etc., can bear such an obligation because it functions on the market. Probably its company can use various methods of mitigating risk, like if we will raise prices for the steam output from the cogeneration project to this local utility. Respectively, local utility can raise the prices for its customers because there is a justification. The market situation changed. The interest rates are high, so probably we can increase the prices. So it is a core of project finance. Try to allocate risks to the party that suits this purpose best. Okay, and in the case of the public sector off-taker or a contracting authority, National Treasury can take over this risk and deal with it as a part of its overall interest rate management or of the government debt. There is also an argument that if a project's revenue is inflation-linked, the interest rate on its financing should also be based on short-term interest rates, which tend to move with inflation. This view has not received much support among project finance lenders, while it is true that the overall trend is for the two rates to move together. It can take a considerable time before interest rates catch up with a high rate of inflation. And we can see it now, really. For example, one of the most economists in the world, the United States economy, the inflation is booming, but we still haven't seen any solid decision about even the timing to raise interest rate. While in other countries, like in Russia, yes, we can see, we observe the inflation, and we also observe very profound and distinct moves of the central bank by raising interest rates. So probably it also a better approach to allocate such risks to the local authorities or maybe a national financial authorities, and for that purpose to have some provisions in the contracts, like we can raise interest rates if the national financial authority also raise an interest rate or inflation is booming, and so on. And interest rate hedging arrangements, therefore, will probably need to be put in place to mitigate the interest rate risk when floating rate loans are used. The commonest type of hedging used in the project finance is interest rate swaps. To a lesser extent, interest rate caps, collars, and other instruments are used. 100% of the risk may not be needed to cover. Alternatively, finance may be provided at a fixed rate, typically through a bond, but a number of issues arise in this case. Sponsors may face particular problems with interest rate movements prior to financial close. So let's probably you already acquainted with these financial vehicles called interest rate swaps, but let us discuss it in detail here also. So under an interest rate swap agreement, one party exchanges an obligation for payment of interest on a floating basis to one for payment at a fixed rate, and the other party does the opposite. Banks and the capital markets run a large book of such interest rate swaps. And the project financing, a project company that has an obligation to pay interest at a floating rate under its loan agrees to pay its counterparty, the bank or banks, the swap providers, the difference between the floating rate and agreed upon fixed rate, if the floating rate is below this fixed rate, or will be paid by the swap provider if the floating rate is above fixed rate. The calculation of interest rate swaps payment. The calculation of the net payment amounts between the project company and the swap provider is based on the notional principal amount for each period. That is amount of loan on which the interest is being calculated. Although in the swap arrangement, neither side lends the other any money, but simply pays over the difference in the two interest rates. And we have also an examples in Excel I prepared for you. So it's again the tools you can use. So please see, this table shows how an interest rate swap between 6-month LIBOR. So we use here the LIBOR because example that was developed earlier. And a fixed rate might work in practice. Assuming that the project company borrows 1,000, that is a notional principal amount, and LIBOR refixed 6 monthly, so 2 times per year, swaps this floating interest rate against a fixed rate of 6% and repays the loan in one installment in the year of 3 years. Thus, the project company has turned its floating rate LIBOR interest payments into a fixed rate of 6%, and the swap provider has done the reverse. So let us check. We have this 6-month period, so it's a half a year each time. We have a principal amount of 1,000. We have a different LIBOR, you can see here. We have a swap fixed rate LIBOR interest calculated. So again, you can use various tools. I already presented to you, but you can see how it's calculated. Yeah, again, you can calculate the fixed interest rate. You can compute the difference, and you can easily compute any proceedings for each party, for the project company, and for the swap provider. So please have a look. I will send you all the Excel files, and if you have any questions regarding calculation and how it will then used in the project finance, no worries, please raise a hand, send me email or type in the chat. Please be acquainted for these instruments, how to calculate swap and then how to use such swaps. Okay, let's back to the presentation and continue on interest swaps. Interest swap breakage cost and credit risk. If the project company prepays the debt or defaults on the debts, the swap arrangement has to be cancelled or so-called broken. The swap provider then enters into another swap for the balance of the term. That is, another party takes over the obligations of the project company. That if long-term fixed interest rates have gone down since the swap was originally signed, the new counterparty will not be willing to pay the same high rate or fixed interest as a project company. And the difference between the original fixed rate and the new fixed rate represents a loss to the original swap provider. This is known as a breakage cost. So the time has passed, your initial counterparty, the project company, has broken the swap, and the swap provider, so the bank, cannot find again the new counterparty for such a swap for the rest of the term because the market conditions has changed, and this leads to the breakage costs experienced by the swap provider. So although the swap provider is not lending any money, it is taking a credit risk on the project company equal to any breakage cost which is due to it. This risk is not fixed number. It can only be determined at the time of the breakage, and so the credit risk which swap provider is taking cannot be precisely quantified when it enters into the swap contracts. Yes, because the nature of such losses depends heavily both on the time elapsed since the inception of the swap and the actual changes in the market conditions. And of course, if when the default takes place, the long-term fixed rate for the remainder of the swap term is higher than the original rate, there is no breakage cost to the swap provider. On the contrary, there is a profit which should be paid to the project companies. So the general principle, if you decided to broke for that or another reason, please cover the cost either to the swap provider or give money back if the situation is better to the project company. And we have a table, another table in Excel, SS 8.2, that demonstrates how the swap breakage cost is calculated based on very nearly the same assumption. We have a loan of 1,000 repaid in one installment. The term of loan is 15 years. The swap fixed rate is 6%, and we have a swap break in after 2 years. And reinvestment rate is 3%. As can be seen, the swap provider's loss on termination and therefore not the same as the notional principal amount, but amounts to the 30 per annum for the remaining 13 years. The NPV of this cash flow is the swap breakage cost. In this case, this is 32% of the notional principal amount. So this is the credit risk on the project company in this particular circumstances at this particular time. Let us see in detail how it's calculated. It's very interesting concept. So you can see we have 2 years past. So we start from the year 3. We calculate on the basis of the notional principal and the original rate, original amount to be paid. Then we have a revised rate that reflects the changed situation in the market and the revised amount of payment for such a swap. And we have a loss for the swap provider that is 60 minus 30. And this loss is equal for the rest of the term of the swap. But how to calculate the actual effect on the swap provider? We have to sum up the discounted value for all these sums. So we introduce the discount factor of 12, and we for the 3%, and we have the net present value of these losses for 319. That is 32% of the notional amount. That means for the credit departments, credit risk departments of the bank, etc., when assessing the credit risk related to the idea of entering a swap with such a project company, that is the assessment of the credit risk. And however, this is an unusual high figure because the loan is not being repaid. And we have another table, 8.3, that sets out the swap breakage cost to remote typical loan cash flow calculated year by year during the loan, assuming that, again, loan at 1,000 repaid in 10 equal annual installments of 100, swap fixed rate is 6%, reinvestment rate after default on the swap is 3%. So pretty the same situation, but we'll have a also different calculation of this NPV for the amount of credit risk bearing by swap provider for each year. So depending on how much years passed and how much years left. Thus, if the project company goes into default just after the time the loan and the swap are signed, the long-term interest swap rates have also gone down from 6% to 3% at the time. The loss to the swap provider is 147. If the default occurs at the beginning of year 2, the loss is 118. And at the beginning of year 3, 92, and so on and so on. The potential loss is the credit risk that the swap provider is taking on the project company. But unlike the credit risk of a loan, this is not a fixed figure, but depends on the remaining length of the swap, the way market rates have changed when the default takes place, whether the original swap is at a historically high or low rate. If at low rate, the likelihood of breakage cost is less because long-term rates are less likely to go even lower and vice versa. A swap provider entering into a swap with project companies, therefore, has to make an initial assessment of the level of the credit risk, which cannot be more than an educated guess at this stage. As can be seen, using the particular assumptions as for the table 8.3, the maximum credit exposure is 15% of the loan outstanding. Very roughly speaking, as there are many variables, for a 20-year interest rate swap based on the amortizing loan repayments, banks might assume an initial credit risk of 15 of the maximum notional principal amount. And of course, in this table, if the investment rate is higher than 6%, there is a profit, which benefits the project company, rather than a loss on the breakage. The calculation of profit or loss on the swap, if it is broken at any point, is known as mark-to-market. A swap that shows a profit on being broke is said to be in the money, and one which shows a loss is out of the money. Probably already acquainted with such terms in the course of derivatives valuations, etc. But we have pretty the same approach here because it's a derivative tool, swaps. For the swap provider bank, arranging a matching swap in the market to cover its interest rate exposure in the swap with the project company is far easier than raising long-term fixed rate funding on lending this to the project company, since its own market counterparts take a much lower credit risk in providing a swap than making a long-term loan. Whereas the bank providing a swap to the project company has easy access to short-term floating rate funding and assumes this will always be renewed. A floating rate lender also may have a small additional breakage cost if the project company defaults between the two interest rate fixing dates. So that's the general approach for the swaps. We have few points to discuss more. So back to the presentation. And the fixed rate quoted by the swap provider is based on three elements. It is a government bond rate for the relevant period in the relevant currency. These provide the base rate for the swap. And for example, a swap of United States dollars for 7 years will be based on the current yield of US Treasury bond for the same period. And in Russia, it can be based on various base rate like key rate or some short rate for the pool of bonds of federal loan, etc. So for each country, for each jurisdiction, and in each country, we have a very different base rate providers. So I say the swap market premium. This is the difference between government bond rates and the swap rates, which reflects supply and demand in the swap market and also in the fixed rate corporate bond market, since corporate bond issuers can arbitrage between the fixed rate market and the floating rate market with the swap. So swap market rates, that is the total of the government bond rate and the swap market premium, are quoted in the financial press on a daily on dealing screens. And we have the third component, that is the swap credit premium. The swap credit premium is the margin charged by the swap provider, and it is the charge for the credit risk of the project company. So that means if the swap provider assumes that the level of risk based on a similar calculation, such as we have seen in the table 8.3, is say, so like in this table, we calculate the 15% of the initial notional principal amount, and the credit margin on the loan for the project company is say 1.5%, then the swap credit premium should be 15% of 1.5%, that is 1.225% per annum. So additional premium for swap providers for arranging such a swap. A structure that gives the project company access to the best market rates is for one or more of the banks in a lending syndicate to act as a fronting bank. The project company goes into the swap market for quotations based on the swap provider entering into a swap with the fronting bank. The project company then enters into identical back-to-back swap with the fronting bank. The fronting bank itself can still quote in competition for the market swaps. And the fronting bank charges the swap credit premium or is counter-guaranteed by the syndicate banks, and it charges a smaller premium reflecting this. A further benefit from the fronting bank structure relates to the swap credit premium, which can cause a problem if there is a swap breakage. The swap documentation just quotes a gross rate, including the credit premium. So as in the case of the which we've seen in the table 8.3, the swap rate of 6% would in fact be a rate, say 5.775% plus a premium of 0.225%. So the calculations as shown in the table is the way in which the swap breakage cost will be calculated in this case, meaning that the project company has to pay NPV of the whole of the swap credit premium for the rest of the long term, even though there is no longer any risk on the project for the swap providers. So that means that if even in a situation if there is no risk, you will also be paying this premium because it's the nature of the business of swap provider. An alternative way to deal with this problem is to pay the swap credit premium under a separate agreement, rather than as a part of the swap agreement. However, in some markets, swap providers are very resistant to giving up the swap credit premiums in these ways. In fact, banks in some markets have relied to a surprising extent on the swap income, both from uncompetitive rates and retention of swap premiums, to subsidize their project finance lending. So for banks, these swap premiums are really interesting and valuable source of income. So even if you try to separate your base rate and the swap premium addition, you hardly can do it because it is a source of income for banks, but you can try. We have also a lower risk. The notional principal schedule used as the basis for the swap is based on estimates of when drawings on the loan will be made during construction and when loan repayments will be made, beginning when the project is completed. These estimates may prove incorrect. For example, a delay in the construction program affects the timing of drawings, or project completion is delayed, which may affect the repayment schedule, as this is normally calculated from the project completion date. If the shift in timing is relatively short period of a month or so, this does not matter, and the swap can be left to run on the original schedule, assuming that the project company will have funds available to make any net payment that is due, since any extra loss in 1 month period is likely to be compensated by a profit in another. If a significant shift in the schedule takes place, say 6 months, because of delay in the project completion, it is preferable to roll over the swap, that is, terminate the original swap and enter into a new one on the new schedule. Any breakage costs of termination would be largely matched by the benefit of a lower long-term fixed rate, and any profit would be compensated for a higher fixed rate. However, the project company may face some difficulty with the swap provider. The swap provider may no longer wish to provide the swap and try to use the rollover request as a way of getting out of it. If there is no competition on the rate for the rollover, the project company could pay too much for the rollovers of swap. If the fronting bank structure we described earlier has been used, rollover of the swap should be less of an issue. In other cases, it may be possible to agree to a competitive approach in advance. If not, the project company and its lenders may just have to take this risk as one of the inevitable adverse consequences of delay in a project completion. And a similar issue arises if the loan amount is increased, for example, by drawing a contingent funding because of the delay in the project completion, and the swap needs to be increased correspondingly. And we have the rest for this very long discussion about the interest rate swap, but it's really a very important tool for the mitigating interest rate risk. That is the core risk in a project finance, in a from the financial point of view. So we have a swap breakage cost and refinancing. The issue of breakage costs also arises if the project company wants to refinance its debt. The normal procedure here is for the new lender, if a bank, to become the counterparty to the original swap in the place of the project company, and then enter in its own swap agreement with the project company. However, this does not mean that the project company ends up paying the swap premium twice. That is, the premium charged by the original swap provider remains unchanged, even though the risk is now on another bank and not the project company. And the new swap provider charges its swap premium for the risk on the project company. So you see this example. The swap premiums are inherent to the construction of the swap. So even you are getting back from the swap, you still have to pay such a premium because it was a part of this calculation of swap rate. And again, documentation. Interest rate swaps are documented in standard form based on documentation produced by International Swap and Derivative Association, and on which there is a limited room for negotiation. This is necessary because swap dealers want to be able to trade their entire swap book on the basis of standard terms. The actual swap cash flows and payments are annexed in a schedule to the standard form. So it's highly standardized tool that allows the swap providers to pool their swaps and use the proceeds to enter the other instruments at their discretion. So let us have a break and digest this very detailed, complex information about the swaps, and let us have a 5 minutes break, and then we will continue for the rest of financial risk and the tools used to mitigate them. If you have any questions, please use this time to address it to me. I'm here for you. Okay, let's continue and discuss interest rate caps and other issues. Under an interest rate cap, so it's a limitation from the above, the cap provider, again usually a bank, agrees to pay the project company if floating interest rates go above a certain level. For example, the current floating rate may be 3% and the cap rate set at 5%. So long as the floating rate remains below 5%, the project company just pays the floating rate. If the floating rate goes above 5%, the cap provider pays the project company the difference between the two in the same way as the interest rate swap. For budget purposes, the project company thus can assume an interest rate cost of 5% fixed, and insofar as the floating rate cost comes out below this level, this is a bonus. Interest rate caps may provide a short-term solution to interest rate hedging. For example, if a floating rate loan during the construction phase is to be refinanced by a fixed rate loan after project completion. So if you already agreed to refinance the floating rate with fixed, but after completion, you still can use such tools like interest rate caps or caps in the process of the construction. They have an advantage that the provider goes not to take a credit risk on the project company, and so can be obtained from any provider in the market. But the disadvantage is that there is an upfront fee payment that adds to the project's development costs. They are therefore seldom used by long-term hedging purposes. However, a cap can be used to put an absolute limit on the level of breakage costs for an interest rate swap, which may be useful for some projects where there is a concern about the level of such contingent liabilities. Another, more sophisticated instruments may be useful for some projects. A swaption or contingent swap is a rate to enter into a swap at a future date, which may give some flexibility of timing, but we will not discuss it in details. If you want, you can refer to this concept in some specific literature, especially, sorry, I will close it now, regarding the derivatives that in a literature list for this course, but it's not really the core concept for such a course. We have a collar arrangements that combine an interest rate cap with a floor rate. That is, the maximum rate is fixed with the cap as above, while if the floating rate goes below a floor rate, say of 2%, the project company pays the difference to the provider. Interest rate collars may be done at no cost, that is, without an front-end fee, because the cost of the cap is offset by the fee received from selling the floor rate. However, the taker of the floor rate has a credit risk on a project company, albeit usually a lower level of risk that for the interest provider. And we have the issues of scale and timing of the interest rate hedging. At the time of arranging the financing, Sorry, I have to reload my PC because something happened and it's crashed. Can you tell me at which point you have stopped hearing me? Like, have we passed the color concept and the scale and timing of interest hedging? Any problems hearing me now? Hello? Can you hear me? Yeah. Oh, we'll stop on the color. Thank you. Just a few minutes. Okay. So let's come back to the colors. And we have the issues of scale and timing of interest rate hedging. So at the time of arranging the financing, the sponsors may take the view that it is more likely that interest rates will go down the top, and therefore they prefer to finance on a floating interest rate basis for the time being. This is unlikely to be acceptable to lenders who will not support the project company taking unnecessary financial risk. However, small this risk may appear at the time. But lenders normally accept that the project company does not have to hedge 100% of its interest rate risk. Firstly, some flexibility needed to be left for the drawdown and repayment timing differences we mentioned above. And secondly, the interest rate risk on contingent funding, which may never be drawn at all, need not to be hedged at the beginning of construction. The project company may agree with lenders that initially it should hedge not less than, say, 90% of its interest rate risk, ignoring contingent funding. Subject to the rollover risk point we discussed earlier, finance documentation can be left sufficiently flexible for a higher level of interest rate hedging to be added later if contingent finance is drawn, or if the project company wants to increase the hedging percentage. And hedging transaction is normally carried out at or shortly after financial close to ensure the budget costs are fixed as quickly as possible. A window of up to a month after financial close may be left for concluding the swap to ensure that the project company does not have to go into the swap market on a bad day. So that's all for the interest rate. And we have another type of risk, an inflation risk. Depending on its timing, inflation may be either a risk or a benefit to the project company. During the construction phase, if price inflation is higher than projected, this may lead to a cost overrun. Most of the construction phase costs should not be vulnerable to inflation-based increases. The major line items, the construction contract price and financing costs, should both be fixed. In preparing the construction phase budget, however, an allowance has to be made for inflation over the construction phase in costs that are not fixed, such as the project company's general personnel costs and purchase of any items such as spare parts not included in the scope of the construction contract. During the operation phase, if inflation leads to a higher operating cost than projected, the level of lenders, cover ratios, and the return for investor may be reduced unless this risk is hedged as we discussed previously. But if the project is just selling into a commodity market, the commodity price is likely to reflect the level of inflation and so provide a natural hedge. Just to deal with the point of terminology before looking at inflation risks in more detail, a nominal cash flow or other calculation is based on the figures which include the effect of inflation, whereas a real cash flow includes inflation. To put in another way, a nominal cash flow is what is actually received in money, while a real cash flow reduces these payments by the rate of inflation to money of day. If the project company has a long-term project agreement under which revenues are received on the basis of agreed contract payments, some elements of the contract payments may be indexed against inflation, thus substantially reducing any inflation risk mismatch between revenues and costs. But paradoxically, as it may seem, if revenues are fully indexed against inflation, the project company still faces an inflation risk. This is because a key element of its operating costs, namely debt service, is not normally inflation linked. Let us see table 5.8, 8.5. Sorry, I will open now. Okay. Which assumes that 1,000 loan repaid in 5 equal annual debt service payment and an interest rate of 6% and illustrates several cases. So case A assumes nil inflation. This produces an overall return to investor of 811. Given that inflation is 0, this cash flow can be discounted and 0%, so it produces a real NPV of 813. So it's a small mistake, 813. Case B assumes 5% inflation of 100% of both revenues and operating costs. As can be seen, case B leaves the investors better off, so that instead of a net cash flow of 813 at nil inflation, the net cash flow becomes 1,023. This is because although 100% of their revenues are going up at 5%, only 72 of the operating costs, that is 237 slash divided by the sum of 600 and 2,237. You can see here these costs. So it's a debt repayment plus operating costs. So the debt repayment, the portion of debt repayment within the total costs. So only 72% of the operating costs are doing so the inflation link, because these costs are not inflation linked. To reflect the investor's real return, the net cash flow can be discounted at 5% rate of inflation, which produces a real net inflation NPV of 877, which again leaves the investor better than a case A. So here we cannot inflate our debt payments. And we have case C that assumes that instead of the projected rate of return of 5%, The actual outturn inflation rate is 2.5. Now it can be seen that if they were counting on inflation remaining in 5%, the investors and lenders are worse off. They receive only 916 instead of 1023 in nominal terms, as a result of inflation only being 2.5%. And investors are also worse off in real terms, with NPV of 848, because the higher the rate of inflation, the more beneficial this is when part of the costs, the debt service, are not subject to inflation. So for investors and lenders, inflation is a two-edged sword. With fully indexed contract payments, inflation higher than projected is a friend, but inflation lower than projected is an enemy. The remaining part of this table shows how inflation risk can be hedged by appropriate level of indexation in the contract payments. Case D and case E are the same as case B and case C, but assumes that revenues are only 60% indexed against inflation. To match the operating costs, it can be seen the result is that the cash flow is almost the same in both cases. So the inflation risk has been substantially hedged. However, in both nominal and real terms, the investors are worse off, and the off-taker or contracting authority, so who pays for the services, are better off than if the revenues had been indexed 100%. These calculations show that it's not possible to produce a financial model using real figures, that is, ignoring inflation. For the purposes of the project finance cash flows, nominal figures which take projected inflation into account were relevant, should be used, and then, if desired, these figures can be adjusted afterwards for inflation. So the general approach, please calculate your cash flows in nominal terms and then adjust it for inflation. So based on the above, the best choice for off-taking contracting authority is to index the contract payments against inflation and a proportion to the operating costs, which are subject to inflation. This cannot be done precisely, as can be seen comparing case D and case C, because the ratio of operating costs to revenues in a table is fixed at 60%. In fact, the operating costs are 60% of revenues in year one, but this percentage gradually climbs as time goes on and increases faster the higher the inflation rate. It is not normal practice to change the indexation percentage for each year. Therefore, the correct way to determine the optimum level of inflation indexation is to run a series of scenarios with a financial model using different proportions of indexation and different inflation rates to find the level of indexation which at least affected the changes in the inflation rate. So probably this will be not the best case, but you can run a series of calculations for the various combinations of this level of your revenues to be inflation indexed and at various level of inflation. And we have other types of financial or economic risks, and let us discuss foreign exchange and refinancing risks. The foreign exchange risks are those risks resulting from movements in the exchange rate between one currency and another. There are a number of different issues to be considered when considering such risk. Managing foreign exchange risk, hedging of foreign exchange risk, local currency debt, liquidity support, catastrophic devaluation, conversion of local currency revenues, and fixing of security in local currencies. So let us discuss in details these issues. What about managing foreign exchange risk? There are two interlinked approaches to dealing with this issue. On the construction phase, during the construction phase, if costs are in one currency and funding in another, the project company is exposed to the risk that the currency in which the costs are being incurred may appreciate. For example, if the construction contract costs $100 and 100 euros of funding for this has been arranged, while the euro to dollar exchange rate is 1 to 1, and the euro subsequently depreciates to the course 1.2 euros per $1, the funding is then only enough to pay for $83. So we will run short of the funds because the 100 euros is not enough to pay for $100. It's clear. To deal with this, the construction cost foreign exchange risk, either the costs have to be redesignated in the currency of the funding, or the funding currency has to be changed into the currency of the costs, whichever is easier, and is also in line with the approach to long-term operation phase. And on the operation phase, during the operation phase, if the project company revenues are in one currency and its financing or other costs are in another, movements in the exchange rate will affect its net revenues and hence ability to repay the debt. Ideally, finance should be arranged in a local currency, hence eliminating such long-term exchange rate risks. But in practice, this may not be possible in developing countries where the domestic financial markets are not able to provide long-term project finance debt. The currency of the revenues, therefore, dictates the currency of financing, or vice versa. Similarly, continuing operating costs need to match the revenue currency as far as possible. It follows from this that if the funding has to be, say, in dollars to match revenues, the construction costs, especially the construction contract, also have to be in this currency. But really, it's not possible in some projects. Even here, from my experience, when we have a huge project, say for construction of shopping malls, and subsequently on the operation phase, the revenues are in rubles, but still all the finance was provided in dollars, euros, but not in rubles. So we bear this foreign exchange risk. So what can we do? What about exchange rate hedging? It is theoretically possible for forward foreign exchange contracts to be used to cover currency exchange rate risks. And this type of a contract, the project companies that had construction costs in euros but funding in dollars could agree at financial close to sell dollars and buy euros on the estimated loan drawdown dates, thus fixing the exchange rate at which euros costs are being funded in dollars. Similarly, a project company that had costs and revenues in dollars but funding in euros could agree to sell dollars and buy euros, and to sell the same amount of euros and buy dollars on the estimated loan repayment dates, which would fix the exchange rate at which the loan is being repaid. Currency swaps between local financial institutions and other lenders
are therefore used in some developing countries as a way of providing the farmer with long-term project finance funding in local currency, which can then be used for the benefit of the project company. But such long-term currency swap, that is 20 years or so, that's the nature of project finance, cannot be arranged in many developing countries because there is no market for such transactions. If the currency swap is entered into with the project company directly, the credit risk assumed by lenders providing such a swap is significantly greater than for an interest rate swap. A movement on the exchange rate of 20% increases loan principal payment and hence the level of risk by 20%, whereas the movement in an interest rate of 20% affects the interest payment only, and assuming the interest rate of 10% equates only to additional 2% per annum of the declining loan principal outstanding. So the exposure and the effect of exchange rate risks are of higher magnitude because the whole budget of the project is affected by that, while interest rate risks first affect only the loan part of your finance and only in the part that reflects your interest payments. So let us discuss a local currency debt. If the local currency loan market can offer the amount and term of financing required in the local currency, this clearly eliminates any long-term currency risk, although there may be a construction phase problem where equipment is being imported, as we discussed previously, and if the local market can prove the debt but is not willing to take project finance risk, then using an offshore guarantee may help to square the circle. Foreign commercial banks could provide such a guarantee, thus dividing the financing of the project from its credit risk. And it's often the case when you import some specific equipment for your project, the guarantee is provided by the bank that is offshore, meaning it's offshore to the residents of the project. Like an example, if you recall the beginning of our course, the construction of this semiconductor manufacturing line, where the equipment was imported from France, the guarantee for the loan covered the financial part of this purchase was provided by French bank Société Générale. Liquidity support. Development financial institutions may be able to provide a standby loan to support a project where its revenues are in a local currency, but financing costs are in an offshore currency, such as dollars, euros, yens, etc. This may take the form of a revolving loan or a guarantee to the lenders who would provide an extra liquidity tranche to cover the time lapse between a devaluation of the local currency and subsequent increase in inflation that should over time be sufficient to compensate the project for the effect of this devaluation on its ability to service foreign currency debt. But please keep in mind that in some cases, such a periods of recovery, so matching the inflation and the actual market prices to the sudden changes in inflation can be very lengthy, and we can observe. Sorry for a minute. I had to Sorry, I'm back again. So catastrophic devaluation. That is a sudden major devaluation of the local currency is now recognized as one of the most serious risks in providing project finance in foreign currencies to developing countries, where the project is not a natural generator of foreign exchange revenues. The currency hedging techniques or liquidity support may enable the project company to deal with the risk of normal market movements in exchange rates. But if economic mismanagement in the host country leads to a major currency devaluation, these techniques are liable to break down. And probably that is the case for many investors in a Turkey-based project now, because we can see the catastrophic devaluation of the Turkish lira, and probably a lot of projects, especially, there is a lot of foreign investment in the residential projects, can bear such risks. Conversion of local currency revenues. What can we say about it? And although a project company's exposure to foreign currency debt may be hedged by indexing its local currency revenues under a project agreement to the foreign currency concerned, this may not provide complete hedging because of timing differences of conversion. So there is a gap between billing and payment, and there is inevitably a gap between the time the project company calculates the amount due from contracting party, including currency indexation, and the time payment of the bill is made, and it usually can be months or more. The project company is thus exposed to further exchange rate movements at that time, although obviously the risk is limited as only 1 month's payment are involved at any one time. The risk can be covered by short-term hedging in a local financial market, if it is possible, or by adjusting the next month's bill to reflect the actual indexed rate at the time the previous month's bill was paid. So you are really limited by the amount of your working capital for this month or more, whatever your work turnover period are. Timing of currency conversions. Host country exchange control regulations may specify that local currency can only be changed into foreign currency when the payment is due to be made, and if revenues indexed to foreign currency that are intended for foreign currency costs, the debt service or dividends cannot be converted until payment of this is due. An unacceptably long period of risk may result up to 6 months and typically half a year. So if forward exchange cover is not available in the local market, the host country's central bank or Ministry of Finance has to be persuaded to allow a more liberal interpretation of the rules to allow immediate conversion. But again, it's very serious efforts to persuade such authorities. Probably the not best approach to deal with it. And we can use fixing of security in a local currency. When a lender registers their mortgage or other security of the project company assets in a host country, local law may require that the amount of mortgage to be fixed and stayed in a local currency, even if the debt is in a foreign currency. This leaves the lenders exposed if the local currency depreciates, and the project company has to other unsecured creditors. It may be possible to register the mortgage for an amount larger than the loan at the current exchange rate. To leave room for maneuver, But if not, the increase in the loan amount in local currency terms will have to add it to the mortgage at intervals, which, besides being cumbersome and involving the project company in extra costs, may not be wholly secure against other creditors for a period of time. So again, we cannot fully hedge such risks. And what is left is a refinancing risk. In some markets, it has not been the universal practice to arranging long-term loans for the project. For example, banks may provide short-term construction loans, which are refinanced by long-term, so-called permanent loans from insurance companies or pension funds, or by bond issues after project completion. The initial loan is usually arranged to mature in a bullet repayment 2 to 3 years after project completion, making it what is known as a mini-perm to allow flexibility of timing for refinancing. This approach may at first sight seems attractive, but it carries major macroeconomic related risks. The first macroeconomic risk is that long-term interest rates may have gone up above the assumptions originally used in the financial model, making it impossible for the project to carry the whole of the debt that needs to be refinanced. Investors could obviously lose heavily on this situation. Interest rate hedging is unlikely to work in this situation, since if banks want lend for a long term, they are unlikely to provide hedging for a long term either. A further macroeconomic risk is that there may be a lack of liquidity in the loan or bond market at the time of refinancing, making it actually impossible to obtain long-term finance when needed. Lenders might also have a concern that the project could going badly at the end of the mini-perm period, and so cannot be refinanced even though the issues above do not arise. So logically, however, either the project will go well, in which case it can be refinanced, or will go badly, in which case there will be a problem anyway. Let us have now a break for say 5 minutes more. Oh no, for 10 minutes we will meet at 2:50, and then we will discuss regulatory and the political risks. So yeah, I know you coming back to your questions. You see the slide because I switched to the slide, but I will send all the slides and Excel files to you. So no problem, because I cannot share the screen and the Excel files at the same time. Okay, you will get all the Excel files. Good. So Nikita, are you okay with it? Good. So have a break. Okay, back to the slides. So all major projects have political aspects. The project company may therefore be subject to political risks relating to the project's presence in a particular country and its relationship with the government of this country, rather than to more general commercial and macroeconomic risk aspects of the project. There are two main areas of risk relating to government actions. Firstly, regulatory or change in law risks, which affect all projects to some extent. And secondly, investment risks, which mainly affect cross-border project investments, primarily in a development country. Linking to the latter are quasi-political risks, which relate to government taking indirect actions against the project. Government plays a very important role in a project finance. Projects financed in this way are usually major long-term investments for which political will and sustained political support are needed. They may also form part of the government policy in privatization or provision of public infrastructures or public-private partnerships whose success or failure will have considerable political consequences. In fact, few major projects can be structured and financed without political backing. Political support from a high level is often necessary to enable a project to be completed successfully. For example, if it is being negotiated with a state-owned or private company, some agreement to participate in the project, and the latter's management may consider that such a contract is not in their interest and would be better if they developed the power station, for example, themselves, as they have done in the past, and thus the power purchasing so thus the power purchaser have no incentive to negotiate constructively. The only way to break this impasse is for the power purchaser to be given strong directions from the host government that they must take this attitude. Once the project is operating, continued political support is needed. The project will be weakened if it becomes a political football because it provides a handle for the opposition to attack the government or for the new government to try to undo the deal agreed by the previous government, perhaps because it did not go through a transparent public procurement processes, or it produces very high returns for the investors and so is open to charges at best of having been favored unfairly or at worst of a corruption. And we can see that even in the global market on country sphere of negotiation, the large investment projects can also be a ball for such a football game. You can see it is with this energy project of Nord Stream 2. Once a project is complete, it cannot be taken out of the country again. And the project company's position inevitably becomes weaker than it was when the host government first wanted to attract investment. This links to the concept of obsolescing bargain, which reflects the way in which the relationship between a major foreign investor and the host government, especially in a developing country, changed as the project progresses. Initially, the host government is anxious to attract foreign investment, and so the foreign investor has the upper hand. But once the investment has been made, the foreign investor becomes less necessary and so a lot more vulnerable to pressure by the host government. Hence, the original bargain between the two becomes obsolescent. Similarly, if there is no consensus on the benefit of the project, this gives rise to problems such as the willingness to pay issue for toll roads, which quickly become very political and can lead to the contracting authority putting pressure on the project company not to charge the full tolls to which it is entitled. Project finance investments are especially vulnerable in this respect. The high leverage means that there is a little room for a project company to adjust to short-term macroeconomic and other problems in the host country. A fixed amount of foreign currency debt service always has to be paid irrespectively of how difficult it might be for the host country. Whereas a project with a much lower leverage has the option to reduce its dividends, and hence relieve some of the stress on the host country's economy. Clearly, this lays a project finance investment open to accusations of just being run for the benefits of foreign investors. So you can see that we have a little room to manage the cash flow, for example, to equity investors, because we have to repay the at least debt and to pay the debt service. And if we have a little proportion of the local currency debt arranged in the local market and the huge proportion of the foreign debt comes from the foreign markets, in stress situations and can be seen by a local audience, like we paying out from the local currency revenues to foreign banks, but not to the local currency recipients and such as equity providers. But it's not the essence of the problem. The problem is that we have not enough cash flows for the reason of stress situation to pay the dividends, but definitely we should have to pay the debt at least. And if the debt is from foreign sources, then it will be payments for the foreign companies. So that leads to such situation. And so, just as the project has to be commercially viable, it must also be politically viable. The fundamental issue is whether the project is seen as a fair and beneficial to its users. If it is not, for example, because the cost of this product or service is out of the line with local cost on comparable projects, investors and lenders can just rely on project contracts and ignore this political aspect. And high rate of return, which is meant to compensate for the risk, may paradoxically increase the risk if it becomes politically unacceptable. The project also has to be set up in a way that leaves the host government in a position to make future changes in the market in which it operates. For example, when signing a toll road concession, the government should consider whether it is subject to provisions such as non-competition, which could prevent the normal evolution of the road network. Okay. In general terms, the project company must operate in a stable legal and regulatory environment. This requires general legislation that allows for private ownership or control of project and adequately protects private investment. A clear legal and regulatory framework for the project's operation. Consistency of legal and regulatory policies. Straightforward procedures for obtaining construction, operation, and financing permits, and the ability for lenders to take and enforce security. The risk of change in law that is regulatory risk, therefore needs to be considered for any project, wherever it's located. In this context, law includes anything having to force of law, and so would include, for example, industry regulations. An adverse decision by a court affecting the project's company costs, rights, or revenues may lie outside this definition, because it could be argued that the court decision does not change the law, but only correctly interprets the law as it stands. And needless to say that indeed most courts would present their decision in this way, including changes in law interpretation of law in the contractual definition of change in law may provide some protection in this respect. So even if the law is not changed themselves, the courts that are the conductors of interpretation of the law can seriously affect the project. So the changes in interpretation of law should also be included in the provision of any instrument regarding the risks of changes in law. The overall issue here is one of value for money. If your purchaser or taker does not pay for the cost of change in law, bidders will probably have to create a reserve from the cash flow to provide finance and when it's required. This will add a cost for the contract payments, even if the reserve is never used. So even if you never use such a reserve, to mitigate the possible risks, you will create such a reserve, and it will increase the cost, and ultimately it will lead to a higher cost and less efficient and attractive project results. Changes in law also have to be tracked and kept consistent between the various project contracts. Thus, under the construction contract, the project company may be responsible for paying for any extra cost that the construction contractor faced from having to modify the specification of the project to comply with changes in law. For example, additional investment to reduce emissions, and cannot penalize the construction contractor for delays caused by having to make this modification. Changes in law can be placed in three categories. General change in law applies to the country as a whole rather than a particular industry or type of a project. One example would be an increase of in-company tax rates. Another might be new regulations for disabled access to buildings requiring modification of existing buildings. Another might be giving employees new pension or sick pay rights. Then we have a specific change in law. This covers the industry in which the project company is operating, or the services which it is providing. This could include, for example, higher taxes on emissions by power stations or reduced emissions limits requiring new investment to meet these limits. And finally, we have discriminatory change in law. This relates to laws or regulations which are specifically aimed at the project company, the particular project, or all projects of this particular type. If the costs of the change in law are to be covered by your offtake contract, this is treated as compensation event. There is no need for a change in law provisions for building service contracts, if such changes are automatically covered by benchmarking, market testing arrangements, etc. If the project agreement does not contain adequate change in law provisions, the project risk in this respect can be substantial. An example of change in law occurred in Europe and Spain, where the government announced in year 2012 that the tariffs payable for power generated by solar or wind energy projects was not sustainable, and that it intended to cap the profits made by such projects. In such cases, foreign investors and lenders may get some protection from bilateral investment protection treaties between their home country and the host government, Spain in this case. And we have investment risks. The standard investment risks are currency convertibility and transfer, expropriation of the project by state, and political violence, that is a war, terrorism, and civil unrest. So that is a political force majeure. Investors and lenders into the country where the project is situated are likely to be concerned about these issues if the project is located in a developing country that is politically unstable or has a lower credit rating. These risks may be passed on by the project company to the off-taker or contracting authority by requiring compensation for the project company if losses caused by them. However, when the time comes, the host government may simply be unwilling or unable to fulfill this obligation, and the political risk guarantees or insurance may be required to cover these risks. So let us have a discussion. Why do projects fail at all? And consider the data gathered, for example, by rating agency Standard & Poor's that rated 510 project finance debt issuers from 1991 to 2012, 34 of which defaulted on their debt. S&P calculate the amount default rate as 1.5, and 65% of the defaults originally received speculative grade ratings, that is below investment grade. There were 2 defaults annually in 2008-2010, 3 in 2011, and 5 in 2012. So this is all the consequences of the crisis. In recent years, the highest level of defaults has been seen in the United States market, which is linked to the fact that a higher than average proportion of United States rate that deals are speculative grade. 7 of 8 defaults were in the power sector, and according to S&P, occurred because of issues such as technology or design failures that lead to a failed construction or chronic underperformance during operations. Operational performance consistently below projections. Poor hedging and commodity exposure to variation in fuel and other input prices. Market exposure on project outputs such as electricity sold in the merchant power market. Structural and financial weaknesses, which were heightened by accidents, court judgments, and unexpected needs for sizable capital spendings. Often an event will only be terminal for a project that is already vulnerable for other reasons and lacks applicable insurance or adequate liquidity reasons, and lacks applicable insurance not only set by some institutional provided vehicles, but other third parties. And S&P commented on this issue. Some of the lower rate power projects were structured with exposure to market on fuel risk, which partially explains the number of power projects in the list of the default. Then we have construction overruns on projects in a sector with complex technology. That was another reason. The transport sector defaults are generally volume-based projects, one that rely on usage, such as toll roads, and that failed due to the lower than expected demand. And most defaults occurred during the construction and early years of the project. S&P also maintains a much larger S&P Capital IQ Project Finance Consortium database containing data on portfolio performance from majority of major project finance lenders. In 2012, there were over than 6,000 projects in this database, of which only 512 had defaulted. Other reasons for failure, besides those listed by the S&Ps in the slide, would include sponsors' inability to raise finance, for example, because the terms of the project agreement or the cash flow make the project unbankable. Low-ball bids by sponsor, especially if there are construction contractors, which assumes that in due course extra cost claims against the off-taker contracting authority will make the project viable. Political interference, examples of which would include requiring a particular bidder company to be chosen on a non-transparent basis, or trying to prevent the project companies using its contractual right to raise tolls, as in Spain. Lack of expertise and experience by the sponsors, contracting authority, and other parties, leading to the drafting of poorly worded project contracts. In the case of natural resources projects, especially in the developing countries, there is a high risk of expropriation by the host government. Very similar results can be found from database of more than 6,000 project finance loans entered into between 1983 and 2011, maintained by the other major rating agency, Moody's. So Moody's said that 307% of these projects went into default. Like S&Ps, Moody's found that defaults generally occur during the construction or early operating phase of projects. Average default rates in the first 3 years from financial close was 1.7%, so less than 2%, declining thereafter, illustrating that construction risks is usually the main cause of default. The rate of default within industries, as stated above, is 7% on average. Can be broken down further. It can be seen that the high-risk industries are manufacturing, 70% of loans defaulted, metals and mining, 12%, media telecommunications, also 12%, and the lowest risk industry was infrastructure, 4%, followed by oil and gas, 8%, and power, 8%. But I should add here, these surveys generally overlook the companies that is not, and the project that is not natural for this type of the new economy companies and new economy projects. For example, should we include any undertakings made by Elon Musk, like should we include SpaceX here? Should we include his project of creating a satellite internet? Should we include even Tesla here to understand, well, will this project goes well, fail, etc.? Because first, they emerge only recently. Second, they are still ongoing. We cannot say for sure that something has gone badly. And the second, the data for such projects are really untransparent. Despite many of them are listed on the stock exchange, the actual reportings often are often subject to the criticism from the financial audience. So let us come back to such a review in 5, maybe in 10 years, and probably we'll see new leaders in this rating, so new leaders in respect to the high probability of default, and again another kind of leaders with low probability of defaults. It's very interesting for me especially to see what projects from these new economy companies are really good or not. Probably you're interested in this too. And within infrastructure, there were 554 projects classified as public-private partnerships. Their default rates, 2.6%, were lower than those for infrastructure as a whole, illustrating that this sector is probably the safest for the project finance lending. With power, as in our cogeneration project, about 1/3 of the projects were in the United States, with an average default rate of 11%, and the 2/3 and the rest of the world with an average default rate of 6%. This mainly reflects the high level of merchant power plant in the United States. Incidence of such defaults peaked in 2004, 2001, 2006, reflecting the losses in the power industry after the collapse of an Enron company. So again, please be aware about the risk profile of the project finance, about these specific features of different industries within the universe of project finance. And again, it is very interesting to see the new data on the new projects emerged on the market in the recent years. So at this point, we finished with the topic of due diligence and analysis of project risks. We have time left for today, and I would like to start the next topic of negotiation of terms and conditions, and give you an overview of this concept. So please now have a break for 5 minutes. So we will meet in 3:25. Okay, I will switch showing now and will prepare the new slides for the next topic.
Back to presentation. Let us start the next topic about the processes of negotiation of terms and conditions. So first, the organizational and legal structure. The project company lies at the center of all contractual and financial relationships in a project finance. These relationships have to be contained inside the project finance box, which means that the project company cannot carry out any other business which is not part of the project. Since project finance depends on the lender's ability to evaluate the project on a standalone basis. Thus, in most cases, a new company is incorporated specifically to carry out the project. The corporate form of borrower is generally preferred by lenders for security and control reasons. The project company is usually incorporated in the country in which the project is taking place, although it may occasionally be beneficial to incorporate it outside the country concerned. And I should say that it's often a case for the reason of control and the protection. For example, we have a lot of project finance where the title for the project and the finance is allocated for the company that is incorporated in some tax shelters or protected legislations like Cyprus, Jersey, Delaware, etc., etc., etc. And in some projects, a form other than that of a limited company is used. The commonest alternative is a limited partnership. So the sponsor's liability remains limited in the same way as if they were shareholders in a limited company. But the income of the project is taxed directly at the level of the sponsors. On a tax depreciation on the capital cost can be deducted directly against sponsors' other income rather than in the project company. Recall this concept that is widely used in real estate investing. We discussed it a few days ago in a course of alternative investing. There is a tax benefit that can be experienced by investors in these forms of limited partnership. Just recall that the rates are often organized like a limited partnership, where we have a general partner who is the manager of rate and the limited partners who are the investors. So very same structures, very same approach across the different disciplines. So where the cornerstone, probably the corner document for the company, it is a shareholder agreement. If there is more than one sponsor, once the project company has been set up and is responsible for managing the implementation of the project, the shareholder agreement covers issues such as percentage share ownership, procedure for equity subscriptions, voting of shares at the annual general meeting, board representation and voting, appointment of the authority of management, conflicts of interest. For example, if the construction contractor is a sponsor, it may not be allowed to participate in the board discussions or voting on issues relating to the construction contract. The budgeting, distribution of profits, sale of shares by sponsors, usually with the first refusal preemption right being given to the other sponsors, or there may be a tag along or drag along rights. That is, if one sponsor agreed to sell its share to a third party, the others will have the option to sell to this party at the same time. It's a tag along, and the drag along stands if
I sell the shares, then I can drag you along with me, so force you to sell shares with me too. Reserved matters, that is decisions which require the approval of all shareholders. Provisions for dispute resolution. It's very important because the very usual situation now, when we have 2 or 3 so original shareholder of companies who was the founder of the businesses in the last 20 to 30 years. It's very usual to the countries of new economies, for developing countries, but as the time passes, these founders of the well-growing business mature, they get old, they tried to exit from the business, but they cannot, because other parties are unwilling, and there is no effective mechanism of resolving such as disputes, because at the time the companies was created, the businesses was set up, nobody was thinking about such problems. So we are lucky, we are proficient. Please consider these provisions as mandatory. So check if their provisions for dispute resolution are in place in your shareholders agreement. It's very important. Some of these provisions may be included in the project company's corporate articles rather than a separate shareholder agreement. And the sponsors may also sign a separate equity subscription agreement with the project company to pay in their agreed levels of equity as and when required during construction of the project. If so, this agreement is assigned to lenders as a part of the security. As I said, 50 to 50, so 1-by-1 joint ventures is not uncommon in the project finance field, and they give rise to obvious problems of decision making. Even in cases with more sponsors, it may still not be possible to get a consensus where a minority partner can block award on the major issues. Arbitration or other legal procedures are seldom a very practical way forward in this context. Clearly, if there is a deadlock, one partner will have to buy out the other, for which a suitable process has to be established. One approach is to require both parties to bid for the other party's shares, with the highest bidder buying out the other sponsor. And in this respect, I just want to present you a very interesting method for deadlock resolution called Russian roulette. Probably someone of you already know it. Please plus in the chart or any other sign if you already know about this concept of Russian roulette. Anybody knows it? So it's very interesting deadlock resolution. So if both parties agreed about upon having a Russian roulette as a deadlock resolution mechanism, they can they have a right at any point of time of the company to put a price. That means if your counterparty give you some price, that means that he is willing to buy out your share at this price, and if you agree, then you can buy this his share for this price. This means, so if someone thinks that he can put a very competitive price, but if this price is not high enough for counterparty to by your own share, that it's a very good and reasonable price. So the first party should be ready for both outcomes of such a proposal. Either the counterparty agreed to sell his share for the specific price, and in this case you are good in establishing this price, or on the contrary, agrees to buy your share for the same price. Meaning, if you are set very low price in your proposal, then you will be bought out by this price and you'll experience a loss. So it's like really only one shot. If you are missed, you are dead. And we have management and operation issue. So let's start in this respect. The project company should have no access or liabilities except those directly related to the project, which is why a new company should be formed rather than reusing an existing one that may have accrued liabilities. The project company also agrees with lenders not to take on any extraneous assets or liability in future. The project company is often formed at a late stage in the project development process, unless project permits have to be issued earlier or it has to sign project contracts, because it normally has no function to perform until the project finance is in place. Sponsors may even sign some of the project contracts for the name of the company to begin with, for example, a construction contract, and transfer term in due course to the project company. Similarly, the project company may not have a formal organization and management structure until a late stage, as the sponsor staff will be doing the project development work. There is, however, only a limited overlap between the skills needed at this development stage and those needed once the project company is set up and the project itself is underway. And so, a new team may take over management of the project after financial close. Arrangements must be made to ensure a smooth transition between the two phases of the project. For example, bringing the post-finance close team into the negotiations at an appropriate point so they can understand what is required. It's also useful for the development team to write an operating manual for the project finance aspects of the project to provide a guide to the documentation and summarize the lender's requirements. Just as the transition from development to financial close needs to be well managed. So the further transition from construction phase to the operation phase may also involve a new team at the project company, and similar transition management is required. There are two main models of how project company can be organized to run the project after financial close. One is to run the project with its own staff, and the other is to outsource part or all of its operations to sponsor shareholders or other third party, and of course pay fees for this. The organization can also be a mixture of these two approaches, with some functions carried out in-house and some outsourced. The decision on whether functions should be kept in the house or outsourced is mainly a question of cost effectiveness. If the project sponsors are undertaking a series of similar projects, a more centralized management of several project companies may be a more economical approach. So, during the construction phase, the project company's personnel may be a combination of its own staff, the staff of the construction contractor, and outside advisors such as owners, engineer. Once the project is complete, operation and maintenance may be carried out by a project company itself or by a third-party operator under operation and management contract or maintenance contract. For example, again, recall this project of construction semiconductor manufacturing line. On the construction development phase, the project team comprises of the persons from the company that will operate and finally own the manufacturing line, that is idea manufacturer Micron, the management company of the holding company from AFK Sistema side, who provides the managerial support and the project operations, the Citronics, the legal and the financial teams from both sides, so Citronics and the lender, the main lender, Rosnano, and of course the technical guys, some construction personnel, other advisors from the company that supplied the technology itself and the equipment. It's STM Microelectronics from France. But when the manufacturing line was constructed and put into operations, from all the people, only those from the actual Micron management and technical staff team remain in a place. So completely different people runs the operation of this project after completion. That's often the case. If one of the sponsors is to take on any management roles, a management contract will be needed and will ultimately be reviewed and approved by the lenders, setting out the scope and cost for such services. These may include matters such as an accounting and tax or personal management. Sponsors are generally well organized in ensuring that all the engineering and construction management expertise is in place at financial close, but sometimes they neglect the finance side of the project's company organization. The new project company needs to have systems in place with personnel who have an immediate grasp of the complex requirements of the finance documentation, not just in relation to drawing and spending the money provided under these arrangements, but also to deal with matters such as the lender's reporting requirement. If the project company intends to use its own staff to operate the project, lenders may naturally wish to be satisfied that the personnel involved have the required experience. Although operating personnel do not have to begin work until the construction process is complete, key personnel have to be in place at the beginning of construction. Firstly, to use the expertise to ensure that the design of the project is appropriate from the operating point of view, and secondly, because the lenders will have to be satisfied that the key personnel are therefore in a place before they start advancing funds. The project company will also have to set up a clear guidelines on the structure and the authority of its management and the extent to which decisions have to be referred to the board. This would normally form part of the shareholders' agreement. A support service agreement with one or more of the sponsors with relevant operating experience to provide the project company with backup technical support, spare parts, etc., may also provide some reassurance to lenders, even though one might expect that whenever or note, there is an agreement. The sponsors will provide technical and operating support to protect the investment anyway. Because a support service agreement should not cost anything unless support is actually required. There is no reason for the project company not to sign one of the lenders feel it to be necessary. Sponsors have to take care, however, that the support service agreement is not used by lenders as a backdoor method of making them liable for the project's performance. For example, by inserting widely drawn clauses making the sponsors liable for negligence. So we have the next very interesting topic about the main financial the field of main application of your main financial field. It is working with commercial banks, and we will start with understanding the internal structure of commercial banks. So how they are working with you, what desks are involved in the process of project finance structuring, who they are, how to approach them. But I would like to stop this lecture now because it's really a huge topic. We shouldn't split it in parts. And we will continue with starting with this concept of working with commercial banks on the next session. So that is that will finish our lecture today. If you have any questions regarding the lecture materials, etc., please type in the chat or raise a hand or make your question by voice. I'm ready to answer, and I will send you all the slides from today's lecture as well as Excel files. If for some reason some of you did not enter this mailing list, so if someone will not receive slides today, please write me back, because probably I omit someone in a mailing list, because we have 53 students enrolled in this course, but the actual number of participants of this mailing list is really less. Okay, so if there is no question, I'd like to thank you for your time on this weekend and wish you a good time for the rest of the weekend. So thank you again. It was a pleasure to giving your lectures. See you on the next lecture.